In the last episode we covered Tutankhamun's life until he was put at rest at 1323 BCE. In this episode we shall shroud ourselves in Tutankhamun's resurrection and life after death. I am your host Morten Eriksson. Welcome to Ancient History. Howard Carter was running out of funds. His patron, George Herbert, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had made this clear. Carter had been in Egypt since 1891 and digging at the Valley of the Kings in search for Tutankhamun's tomb since at least 1915, but had come up with nothing of worth. But so, on the 4th of November, he notes in his diary, "They have found a step in the sand." It was in fact a water boy named Hussein Abdel Rasoul who had first seen the step. It was the first step of the staircase leading down to the tomb. The fact that it had been so hard to find was Ramses V's fault. During the construction of his chambers some 178 years later, the gravel and stones from that work soon covered the already forgotten tomb. And on top of that, huts were built for the workers. It was not until the archaeologists realized that these huts did not exist at the time of Tutankhamun that their interest turned toward that area. Still, they were not certain. The stairs led into the ground until they reached the wall covered with plaster, the so-called false door, and so the unbroken seal. A jackal resting on 3 quelled slaves, the sign of the pharaohs, and just beside it, hieroglyphs, a straw, a falcon, a wave, and the symbol Ankh, reading Tutankhamun. Carter had finally found his prize. The false door was usually formed or painted like a door. Its purpose was to keep the grave sealed, but to let the spirit of the mummy pass freely between the two worlds. In an arranged photo, Carter and his staff can be seen peering into the newly opened grave. Somewhere behind it, the untouched seal. On the actual day, George Herbert had followed Carter down into the shaft. Carter was peering into the antechamber. "Can you see anything?" asked George Herbert. "Yes, wonderful things," answered Carter. He later recalled the scene, "as my eyes grew accustomed to the light. Details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold." It was clear that the grave had been robbed at some point, leading Carter initially to think that it would be empty. But it soon appeared that the grave goods had been returned. It was also obvious that Tutankhamun had been buried in haste. Only the grave chamber itself has murals. In other tombs, the entirety is usually decorated, and splashes of paint tells the story of haste. Adding to this, the grave was shut with the paint still moist. Everywhere one can see the black dots from the mole fungus Aspergillus niger. Howard Carter was followed by a photographer named Harry Burton from the Metropolitan Museum, who took a vast collection of excellent pictures during the excavation process, about 2,800 of them, constituting a treasure of their own. His pictures show not only the finds but also scenes from the excavation, the state and arrangement of the tomb, of workers carefully removing the finds, being transported away on a small railway, of later visitors queuing up to visit the site. The grave contained over 5,000 pieces of treasure ranging from Tutankhamun's stillborn mummified daughters to the magnificent solid golden mask weighing in about 10.2 kilograms. This picture from November 1925 shows Tutankhamun lying intact with the burial mask still on. And this photograph shows parts of the antechamber with a lion bed, the boxes beneath it, and an ivory and ebony chair is believed to have been used by Tutankhamun when he was a child. A statue of Anubis upon a shrine intact with poles for the pallbearers. For the most part, Carter and his team were careful and took good care of the finds, carefully removing the linen the treasures were shrouded in, or lifting them from their resting place. There are so much richness and detail in the tomb that it would be impossible to cover it all. Therefore, let us look at some specific details that can say something about Tutankhamun's life. As we have already learned in an earlier episode, Tutankhamun suffered from some sort of deformation of one or both feet. In the reliefs or sculptures that are picturing him, as a consequence, he is almost always depicted with a walking stick. I say almost because there is one specific scene where he is not pictured in that way, but I will get back to that in a moment. We can see him, for instance, in this relief together with his wife, Ankhesenamun. Therefore, in retrospect, it is not surprising to see him buried with a cane or walking stick. But Tutankhamun was buried with no less than 130 sticks. Some of these are of the most exquisite quality, especially the grips. Some of them carved like humans, men from the Middle East, or as in this beautiful craftsmanship, a sub-Saharan woman. It is absolutely stunning in its detail. It is apparent that he needed to be able to walk also in his afterlife. In the tomb there were also found several bows and arrowheads, and we know from pictorial representations that Tutankhamun was an apt bowman. And it is in this environment, in his chariot, that we see Tutankhamun, in well-known Egyptian and Middle Eastern style, laying down wildlife and enemies with his arrows, as can be seen in this golden ostrich or in this mural. Here we see no walking aid. Perhaps there was a way for him to ride the chariot without that support. Perhaps it is just propaganda. Historians have doubts about his ability to actively have participated in battle or hunting. Another distinct feature that is apparent for the trained eye is that much of the grave goods appear to have been intended for someone else initially, more specifically a woman. Much of the art show traces of having been reworked before burial. Looking for example at his canopic jars. The canopic jar had a long tradition in Egyptian burial rites. These were the jars where stomach, intestines, lungs and liver were kept after mummification. But not the more precious heart. It was usually put back into the body before burial. Tutankhamun's canopic jars are beautiful with exquisite female faces on each of the 4 cups. But the fact that these are female faces reveal that the jars were probably intended for a woman, and not a man. Further evidence are the hieroglyphs on their inside. Here, Tutankhamun's name has been engraved on top of the earlier owner, the mysterious female pharaoh Neferneferuaten, who ruled before Tut. Who this earlier woman was is not fully known, but more on that in a later episode. The same goes for the huge red sarcophagus. It bears traces of inscriptions for someone else, although it is not possible to determine who. And looking closely, the wings of the 4 protecting goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith and Selket, sits deep in the stone. An earlier layer has been worked away to give room for the present. The apparent rework is also true for perhaps the most famous of all the artifacts, the huge solid golden burial mask. Analysis shows that the face is not the original. The original face was at some point cut away and the new face of Tutankhamun was put in its place. The new one is of a lighter gold of 18.4 carats, while the rest of the mask was made in darker gold of 22.5 carats. Even on the mask, the name of Neferneferuaten can still be seen. All this tells the story of a hasty, unplanned burial. If it was because of a hasty death, which we know that he suffered, or that the successor, the next pharaoh, just wanted to get him into the ground? We do not know. Making these 2 episodes made me realize that there is so much to say about Tutankhamun and his family that it will never fit into 2 short episodes. I am sure I will return to similar topics in the future. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun continues to fascinate us as a gilded representative of all of Egypt's ancient history. Thank you for joining me. In the next episode, there will be something completely different. Hi again. If you like this episode, hit that like button, share a link with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you would like to help me make even better documentaries about the past in the future, please consider joining me at Patreon. I have put a link to my site in the description below. See you in the next episode.